Okay, so I'm going to keep the video and the assignment for today pretty short. That way you guys can focus on just getting caught up on all three of these naming assignments. Naming ionic compounds, naming covalent compounds, and then the one for today, which will be naming acids and bases. Alright, so first thing is telling them apart. Acids and bases are both ionic compounds. They're just kind of more specific types of ionic compounds. So acids will have a hydrogen, an H plus, as their cation, and then bases, most of them will have uh, a hydroxide, an OH minus, as their anion. That's kind of how you can tell which one you're looking at. There's more specific definitions of each of them, and we'll get into them later when we talk about acids and bases more in depth. When we're just talking about naming them, this is kind of all you need to know in order to tell them apart. All right, when you are naming acids, there's basically three different formats they can take. All right, and their names are all based off of whatever their anion is. So whichever is the element or the polyatomic ion that is attached to the hydrogen, that's what you're going to be naming it after. All right, so if the regular ionic name for it would end in IDE, if it was a regular binary, just hydrogen and one other element, then you're going to name it hydro, that element, ic acid. Right, and that's a little confusing, but I'll show you an example here in a second. If it is a polyatomic ion, your cation or your anion, that ends in 8 as its ending, then you're going to drop the hydro and it would just be whatever that polyatomic anion is, and then ic acid. And then if it's a polyatomic ion that ends in ite, ite, then instead of ending in ic, it's going to end in us. All right, so those are the rules you're going to have to follow. So, example, here we've got sulfur and hydrogen. So, simple, binary, two elements is all it is. So, if we're following our rules here, if this was just a regular ionic compound, we would call it hydrogen sulfide, right? So if it ends in ide, this is now going to be called a hydrosulfuric, because it's from the sulfur, acid. So hydrosulfuric acid is H2S. All right, this next one, it has an SO4, and if we go look at our polyatomic chart that you guys have seen before. Okay, so if we go look at the polyatomic chart that you guys have seen before, you can look and find sulfate down here. So SO4 is sulfate. So if we're going back to our rules, if it ends in 8, instead of hydrogen sulfate, this would be sulfuric acid. All right, because you're taking the S from, or the sulfur from sulfate, and it doesn't have the hydro in front of it, so it's just sulfuric acid. The last one, it's H2SO3. That SO3 is sulfite. So our rules say if it ends in ite, it's going to end in OUS as our acid name. So instead of hydrosulfuric or sulfuric, this would be sulfurous acid. All right, and that's basically all you're doing for the acids. You just got to figure out what the ending would be in a normal ionic compound, how you would name it usually, and then use that to figure out what the acid name is based off of these three rules here. All right, for bases, so there's actually nothing special about naming bases. Bases are named exactly like any other ionic compound. And most of them have OH as their anion. So they should end in hydroxide for most of the ones you'll see. So if you've got Na and OH, Na is sodium, OH is hydroxide, so you'll just call it sodium hydroxide. This one here is cobalt and hydroxide. And so since cobalt is a transition metal, remember you've got to do the thing with the Roman numerals to tell me what the charge of that cobalt is going to be. Since we know OH is -1 and there's 2 of them, that means the cobalt has to have a charge of +2 to cancel them out. So you would have cobalt 2 hydroxide. Alright, this stuff exactly the same as the ionic compounds you've already done. Alright, and then this last slide is some references for y'all. We've got periodic table link here and a list of a bunch of the common polyatomic ions that you might need. That's all there is to it.